Well, for the last few years, there has been quite a bit of evidence that detainees at Guantanamo Bay have been involuntarily drugged with powerful antipsychotics. And in the last few weeks, the case of David Hicks, an Australian held at Gitmo, is bringing more and more attention to the issue, and also bringing forth questions about the purpose of this, the long-term effects, and the legality. Well, now it appears the Department of Defense is trying to cover up some of these charges of drugging, as suggested in a DoD Inspector General report. Scott Horton is a contributing editor at Harper's Magazine. He's covered Guantanamo Bay for years and joins me now from New York City. Hey, Scott, many layers here, a host of different drugs used in different circumstances. But what's the bigger picture from what we know so far? Is this even legal?
Well, that is the big picture. I mean, the big picture is whether it's consistent with the Geneva Conventions and other international instruments. And we know that the Bush administration originally set up the Guantanamo Bay facility with the expectation that it would be beyond the reach of laws and courts, that it expected that the Geneva Conventions and other international conventions simply wouldn't apply to what was done there. And this attitude seems to have inspired some medical experimentation, because I think that's what we see evidence of here. We see the use of psychotropic drugs and other drugs for purposes that really don't have anything to do with health and safety of the prisoners. Now, I think the authorities certainly could vaccinate prisoners. If they're sick, they could give them medicines to address the situation. If they're making a ruckus, they could be given sedatives and things of that sort. So there are certain circumstances in which drugs can be used. But if we look in detail into these reports, we see drugs being used that don't match those circumstances.
Yeah.
Where the
some of these drugs that we're hearing about, they have the ability to cause, increase in heart rate, to cause blurred vision, and also to cause hallucinations. So it's very confusing, I think, if you're trying to get intelligence, accurate intelligence, how these mind-altering drugs would help.
Well, it seems that these drugs were probably used in the preparatory stage. So they are trying to prepare a prisoner to be interrogated. They want to break the prisoner. They want to free him up, loosen him up to speak freely. And the drugs, I say a combination of drugs and food, seem to be used along with many other things that affect the environment of the prisoner to prepare them. And that's
Sorry, Scott, we were having a couple audio issues with you. But let's stay with this. I mean, in the now declassified Guantanamo Medical Standard Operating Procedure, a description lays out how the drug scopolamine, I think it's called, was administered to all Gitmo detainees. This is a drug often referred to as the, quote, truth drug. How did they come to this designation?
Well, that drug has also been used for motion sickness and other things, but the military, in fact, stopped using it for that purpose because of side effects. And we know that the intelligence community was experimenting with the drug for some period of time, potentially including just in the last few years, as a sort of truth serum. So I think, this is another area where we have a question clearly being presented, and we have answers coming back from the Department of Defense that really aren't satisfactory. And in addition to what happens with the Defense Department at Guantanamo, we also have the CIA using drugs, in fact, sometimes many of the same drugs, and we know that from criminal investigations that went on overseas. So, for instance, with a German citizen named Khalid El-Masri, who was held by the CIA in Afghanistan. When he was released, he was examined by criminal authorities in Mexico, including their doctors, and they concluded that he had been drugged with the use of psychotropic drugs. So I think we see a pattern that emerges there as well.
And that's a really sad story. I know you covered that a couple of years ago, because from all signs point to the fact that he was a case of mistaken identity, and even once that was realized, they kept him there for, quote, knowing too much. So, I mean, it's really crazy to think that this can go on. I do want to talk also about the cover-up. A recent report put out in response to a Freedom of Information request essentially says it found nothing. It could find no evidence to substantiate allegations that mind-altering drugs were administered to detainees. We've seen evidence come out in certain cases, especially straight from the horse's mouth, from people who have been in Guantanamo Bay and say, yes, I was given a needle, I was drugged. And now there's this Inspector General's report that says, no, we actually don't know of any of that happening. So what's going on here?
The Inspector General report in this case is extremely suspicious because I think it lays out the sort of base of information and then it refuses or fails to draw obvious logical conclusions from the information that it presents. But I think you can understand the dilemma. Let's just assume that the use of these psychotropic drugs have been approved by the government at the highest level. And based on documents that we've seen come out of the Department of Justice and Department of Defense, we know all these issues were taken essentially to the top, to the White House, ultimately for review and approval. And let's say the use of these drugs was in fact approved, and that's also based on legal advice that the Geneva Conventions and other international agreements didn't apply. Well, if they did apply, then the use of these techniques would constitute a grave violation of the Geneva Conventions, that is to say, a war crime. In fact, something where the United States insisted adamantly on prosecutions at the end of World War II and the Korean War. So you've got a Department of Defense Inspector General who, I would submit, does not want to put together the prosecutor's playbook for him. So the report just suddenly goes silent at key junctures.
I think it's important when we talk about this to sort of point out an irony here. Prisons here in the United States are filled to the brim with prisoners often arrested on drug charges. And yet when it comes to prisons in other countries, but run by the U.S., drugging seems to be part of the protocol. I guess it's just kind of an interesting contrast to look at. Do you think most Americans are even aware of this?
Well, no, this is one of the great ironies of American culture, of course. That is, we have one of the most rigorous anti-drug prohibitions in force anywhere in the world. And at the same time, we are one of the most drug-happy cultures in the world. In fact, strike one up. We are the most drug-happy culture with the highest degree of over-the-counter drug dispensing and also advertising on our television for prescription drugs. That's one of the conflicts that exists here. And I think we see, we see here attempts to use drugs for interrogation and intelligence gathering purposes. And they may in fact be useful to some extent for that purpose, but you run into the problem that it's against the law.
Now, do you think that, obviously we started to hear about these things, back in 2008, but there's new light being shed on the case of this Australian. Do you think having this come up time and time again will have an impact sort of on, foreign relations or, the view of this country and its practices from outside of the country?
It already is in a big way. I mean, so for instance, just about 10 days ago, the Supreme Court in Italy handed down a major decision in which they upheld the conviction of 23 CIA agents for their involvement in the operation of one of these black sites and an abduction operation. We know prosecutors in Poland are aggressively pursuing things. There's still an ongoing criminal investigation in Germany. We know the president of Egypt, who's here in New York today, giving remarks, has in fact denounced the way black sites were operated on Egyptian territory and called for the United States to reform. So I think we can say that this issue has turned out to be a huge irritant in U.S. relations with key allies around the world, and a very strong message is being sent to the United States that's got to change its wicked ways. And part includes the use of drugs on prisoners, which is really not accepted by the international community and is really not accepted by U.S. law either.
Yeah, certainly something interesting to talk about. A lot of people are not writing about this or talking about it, so we appreciate you giving us your insight and your years of research on this issue. Scott Horton, contributing editor at Harper's Magazine. Thanks so much.